Okay, so here we are. Hello. Good
Hello.
Valentine. Hello. Good Valentine's Day for everyone. And we are sending much love to the war sites in the world, mainly now Gaza and Ukraine, so that this love may make the minds of the people which need to take decisions a little bit more sound. So we are wishing you much love in all the areas of your life and with all the people you relate with as well. So hello,
Right.
Ken. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy
And
Valentine's Day to you.
yes, thank you. And also thank you very much for this opportunity to be here with you in such a special day, giving this
Certainly.
message.
Sure.
Because this message we are giving, doing this on the 14th of February every year, it is a real message of love and remembering
Yeah.
that love exists and that love is true and our friendship on the years and through the years show that love exists. And therefore, we send this love to everyone that listens or that reads this interview, which, as always, I created through the questions posed by the international integral community. You know that.
Yeah.
So here we are with this man that has been the creator of the integral theory, that has written more than 25 books translated to most of the
It's
known
up
languages.
to 35 books now.
35 now, my goodness. Yes, wow. I have to update then my numbers. So
Yeah.
35 now. Congratulations on those 35.
Thank you.
Sure, sure, because that's a great production of the most advanced thought, because you are a thought leader in this world. And
Yeah.
it is wonderful that you are still, with us and still writing, which is
Right.
beautiful. So thank
Right.
you
And
very
I just finished my latest book called Finding Radical Wholeness. And
We are that's the last question, because we want to know about that, and there is a person which wants to also know about that, and that's the last question we are going to pose, which is
right.
about this book that you are making. Okay, so if you agree, we start with the first question, which
Sure.
it is: do you know the Austrian tradition of economics? Is this question, a person makes it because this tradition has an evolutionary perspective on social processes that would match very well, according to this person, the integral vision. So do you know that?
Yes, I've studied it briefly, as I have most worldwide systems of thought. Um, and I have incorporated some of its essential elements into my system, which I usually, whatever system I study, I generally take something from that system and incorporate it into integral meta theory, just because that's how I think. And also, that's the claim of integral meta theory, is that it has looked at most of the world philosophies or systems of thinking or economics or politics or sociology or psychology, and has found a framework that incorporates the essentials of all of them. And that's the claim that I make. And so I have done that. And I liked it. I mean, I thought it was a very impressive economics theory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you integrate these ideas on your own integral vision to make it
Right.
more whole, precisely, right?
Right.
Very good, very interesting. According to how the economics in the world go now, where do you think that the economy, the worldwide economy, is going?
Where do we, what?
The world economy being nowadays pretending to be global, do you think that we will get there? We will get some time to create a global economy which will be more useful for human beings, will be more equal?
Well, that's the hope. And of course, given the fact that the world is driven by a set of factors or forces or pressures or inclinations, and that does include an eros, which is a transcend and include drive, the evolutionary force. And evolution has been the main predominant thought system of the modern and postmodern world. Darwin, of course, is credited with introducing it. But much of present day economic theory doesn't come from Darwin, because we have, well, random mutation and natural selection are not nearly enough to account for the vast diversity and the probabilities that those would arise through just natural selection and random mutation. So at least 50% of modern evolutionary theorists include another force that's operating in the world like a real force, like gravity or electromagnetic or light and so on. But it's a real force, and it's what I call eros, and the most widely used term for it in evolutionary theory is self-organization. And the world is driven by a force of self-organization. And that's why if you just look at the overall sweep of evolution, you go from quarks to subatomic particles, to atoms, to molecules, to single cell animals and plants, to multicellular animals and plants, and then up the entire tree of life. And each and every one of those different stages transcends or goes beyond the previous stage, and yet it includes in its totality the previous stage. So when you go from atoms to molecules, molecules all contain atoms, but it goes beyond simple atoms because a molecule is much bigger and more complex, and it contains hundreds generally of atoms. So, and then when molecules come together and we get another transcend and include, then we get living cells. And cells include molecules, but they transcend them because, first of all, they have life, they're alive, and they reproduce. And so when we go from single-celled animals to multicellular animals, the same thing. Many cells come together and are included in a multicellular animal, but the multicellular animal also transcends the individual cells because it's multicellular.
So
And
regarding economics, Sorry, because I wanted to center that regarding economics. Do you mean that then you foresee, let's say, that we are going to transcend what we are having now, and we are going to finally arrive to some kind of a more real globalized economy that will be like useful for everyone and more equitable?
Well, it's already happening. If you look at artificial intelligence, for example, it's explosively moving forward and evolving. And it both transcends and includes all the previous artificial intelligence. But then when they introduce so-called machine learning or deep learning, artificial intelligence started to write its own programming. And that's so complex, we don't even know what it's doing. So if a AI machine breaks down, we can't go in and fix it because we don't even know what it did to create itself.
Right.
And it's a massive evolutionary leap forward. And it's already happening all around the world. So, and this is all non-Darwinian driven, because Darwin didn't have any understanding of self-organization. He thought it was just random mutations and natural selection. And as I say, that's not nearly enough to account for the evolutionary drive and its vast sophistication. I mean, even the number of changes in a complex animal structure, the number of changes required to produce a horse is 1 to 10 with 300,000 zeros.
Yeah.
It's just, it's out of this world. And there's no way, I mean, we get random mutations, most of which, by the way, are deathly lethal. They're not some great advance or something. They're lethal. But to get 10 to the 300,000th mutations is just impossible by any sort of natural process. It doesn't work. And that's why there are two aspects to evolutionary theory. There's the what of evolutionary theory, which is the actual stages that evolution has gone through. And nobody disagrees with this. This is why it's common to hear an evolutionary biologist say evolution is just completely accepted and nobody disagrees with it. And he's talking about the what of evolution, because evolution did go from quarks to subatomic particles, neutrons, photons, electrons, to atoms, to molecules, to multi-molecular molecules, to single living cells, to multicellular creatures, to the whole tree of life, going from fish to amphibians to reptiles to primates to complex primates to human beings. And nobody doubts that sequence. Every evolutionary biologist in the world agrees with that general sequence. The what of evolution is not doubted at all. It's the why of evolution that has so much controversy, and why so many biologists have introduced the third notion of a complex self-organization that drives the series of whats. And so that drives us from quarks to atoms to molecules to single cellular animals to multicellular animals to amphibians to fish to reptiles to mammals and primates and humans. That's all driven by a self-organizing eros. And that's an absolutely crucial component of integral theory, is an eros, a transcending and including force. And most, but not all, of evolutionary biologists accept this self-organizing force. Not as many for the why of evolution. Not as many evolutionary biologists accept this why as accept the what, because virtually 100% of them accept the what. Yes, there were quarks, then there were gluons and muons and so on, and then they came together into protons, neutrons, electrons. They came together into atoms. Atoms came together into molecules.
Not again.
And
so
just with that,
let's hope that then we really do arrive to this what and why in the economics,
right.
which
right.
know.
And as I said, it's already happening in artificial intelligence. I mean, you see this incredible self-organization in AI, artificial intelligence. And that's why we're already getting this deep machine learning and self-programming where the AI actually programs itself in ways that are so complex we don't even know what it's doing.
I know.
And that shows how extraordinary evolutionary drives are.
Let's go with the second question, if you find it acceptable, which it will have to say, would you say that we are experiencing a regression in values? Are we sacrificing the most universal democratic values by another more egocentric, only based in economic interest? Do you think so?
Well, that varies if you look at different subsets of evolutionary unfolding. If you look at universities, if you look at economics, if you look at technology, if you look at religion, and there are several places where we're seeing regression. One of them, for example, is there's a fair amount of regressive tendencies in universities where that never was the case. I mean, universities were founded mostly by religious spiritual orders 100 to 200 years ago. But when they were first founded, they really were centers of learning and education, and they weren't very regressive. But recent universities, and especially the well-known, the Ivy League and the prestigious universities, they're undergoing a significant regression. And you see that in the cancel culture and in when they bring in certain speakers. If the speaker is anywhere near conservative, the students rebel against them and they'll refuse to let them speak. And it's just really horrible.
It is.
And it's especially bad because we look to universities as the leading edge of our thinking. And the leading edge of our thinking is going backwards. it's just really horrible. And then there are little pockets of exceptions. So there are, for example, there are an increasing number of integral disciplines. So we have integral psychology, integral sociology, and there's
medicine, philosophy, medicine.
yes, yeah, there's integral philosophies,
Mhm.
and so those are starting to show up because we still have this inherent drive to eros. And there's an inherent drive to transcend and include. And so we not only have a lot of disciplines like biochemistry, the integration of biology and chemistry, which is quite highly accepted. And you also have humanities where you have fairly integrated and integral and systemic integral endeavors. So I've always been encouraged by the at least small packets of integral thinking that are going on in universities. If we look at our religions, they also tend to be a little bit regressive. And to regress in religion, it's only necessary that you accept the typical mythic, literal version of religion. So the entire Bible is a mythic document. And it's actually the stage that has been called mythic literal, because it's taken to be that, like, Jesus Christ is the literal son of the literal biological son of the literal soul creator, biological creator of the entire universe. Well, that's all mythic literal stage of development. That's the thought of a 5 to 7 year old. And so all you have to do is just accept the Bible and you're regressing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not good. In technology, we don't see that much regression because we do see the progressive move of deep machine learning and so on. So technology is continuing to advance, and quite rapidly.
And do you find that technology and values are really evolving parallel? Because I
well,
don't
technology is also tending to advance with AI and some of these other areas. We're seeing a progression in those and a general progression in technology itself. So those are, so we can see some places where there's an advance, a genuine, full-fledged advance or evolution of the discipline. And in other disciplines and other areas like universities, we see a regressive tendency. And I would say if we just look at culture in the United States, that there's something of a very modest regressive tendency in our culture at large. And that goes for the culture in Europe as well. But I don't see that being massive. But what we call woke culture is a regressive move. And that's why there are so many jokes about wokeism And we do tend to see them jokeable. I mean, they're worth making fun of because wokeism is just idiotic. It's just completely stupid. And by stupid, I mean regressive, intellectually regressive. And so
this comes very good with the third question then, which is,
right.
would you say Trump is orange or turquoise? How do you envision his situation right now at the American politics scenario?
He's orange. He's not turquoise. But orange is anti-woke, because woke itself is anti-orange. It's anti-rational. It doesn't believe in rationality. And that's where you get a lot of the jokes about wokeism, is it denies objectivity, it denies rationality. It doesn't say that there's even such a thing as objective truth. It just doesn't exist for wokeism. And that in itself is hysterical. So, I mean, is it objectively true that there is no objective truth? That's what wokeism claims. So it's just one buffoonery after another that we get from the woke crowd.
So tell us about Trump. How do you envision his future and the future of America with Trump?
Well, if you look at just the woke part of him, because he's definitely anti-woke. Almost every word out of his mouth is some non-politically correct statement. He's just completely anti-woke. And so from just that narrow perspective, he is going to move us forward because he's progressive in a true sense, even though his politics is fairly conservative. But it's not the woke version. So it's a positive move. He does have that degree of small amount of positive, progressive, anti-wokeism. And that's good. And I think that's what America sort of realized when they went from an anti-woke Trump to a very woke Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden is a politically correct, senile idiot. I mean,
oh my God.
Qualities and all of that, but he is very, very woke and very, very politically correct. And people really
excuse me, do you say
just really get down on him? And
Ken, I didn't understand very well. Do you said politically correct or politically incorrect, Biden?
Politically correct.
Correct. Yeah, I understood. Yeah, I understood well then. Yes.
And Thomas Sowell, who's a very, very bright, very smart political thinker, he's just devastated Biden for his political correctness and his wokeism. And he's exactly right. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Sowell and Charles Murray and other public intellectuals that are very anti-woke. I'm impressed by, well, both of those thinkers, Thomas Sowell and Murray. Um, so, and I'm glad they have the acceptance, the general acceptance that they do. They're both very prolific YouTubers. You see a lot of YouTube documentary productions on by both Charles Murray and Thomas Sowell. And Thomas Sowell is in his 90s now, and he's still going absolutely strong. He's just brilliant. And he has been since he was in his 20s. I first became a big fan of Thomas Sowell when he was like 25, because he was just right on the money about everything he said. And I was always impressed by that.
Okay, I see. So let's see, what is the influence of philosophical mistakes made by the global academy mainstream, these academic thoughts on the contemporary Russian-Ukraine war? What is this philosophical mistake you think they have perpetrated?
Well, they're not integral. And that's the main complaint I have about any major discipline. If there's something wrong with it, it's that it's not yet integral. And so it ends up reinforcing wokeism and politically correct thinking and all of the disasters of the modern intellectual and the postmodern intellectual. And they just aren't integral. And there's no excuse for that today, because not only does every major discipline we have add something important to our overall world perspective, that you can't give an excuse for not including what they offer. And the only way to do that is through an integral framework. And so there's just no excuse in today's world for not having an integral view. And yet, if you look at all the mistakes in our intellectual thinking, almost all of them are versions of not integral, not inclusive, not comprehensive. And that's just a disaster.
And yet the academical world still is like not wanting to understand and embrace integral thinking. And I don't understand that either, really.
No, I don't. I really don't understand that part. And as much as I make room for virtually all sorts of disciplines, I can't make room for that one. Because that one says, how do you make room for something that says, I don't want to make room with anything?
Right.
I mean, what? There's just no room for somebody that won't make room.
That's right.
All of it.
Absolutely.
Ridiculous.
It is. It is. So, Ken, another question that another person has is, why don't you present yourself as a leader in your own integral community? And also, are you an integral or a sage?
Okay. Well, when I started writing, I wrote my first book when I was 23, Spectrum of Consciousness. And that sort of introduced me to most of the intellectual writing community, at least in America. So I would just bump into everybody from Fritjof Capra to Stan Grof to, all of these people. And what all of them would do is they'd write one book, like Fritjof Capra wrote The Tao of Physics. And then they would have to go on the road and give talks about their book. And that's almost all they did. And so they wouldn't write anything more, or if they did, it would be 10 or 20 years from their first book until they'd write their second book, which many of them would. So Friedrich wrote a second book and a third, but they were all like 10 years apart. And what they were doing during that time was assuming leadership for the branch that they had written about. So when Friedrich Capra wrote the Tao of Physics, which, by the way, is an entirely misplaced theory, because what he's trying to say is that modern quantum physics proves mysticism.
Yeah.
Because quantum physics means the mind is one with everything that it's aware of, and the mind actually creates what it's aware of by collapsing the quantum wave packet in every atom, and that makes the electron take an actual position in space and time. And so the mind, we create that which we are perceiving. And that's just categorically wrong. But he just gave talk after talk after talk on how that's what quantum mechanics is showing us, that the world is a unified reality, a mystical oneness because of quantum mechanics. And that's just not the case at all. So I was always a little suspicious of all of my friends that I was getting to know, who always went out and assumed leadership of the field that they had written in. And I just couldn't, I was always going, I don't want to make that big mistake. So I'm gonna kind of avoid that. And I had.
You never liked that. You never liked to be a guru at all. I know. I know that.
And even though what I was writing, I believe time has shown that what I was writing was correct. The integral approach is a true reality. It's actually there, it exists, and it continues to spit out more truths. And so I at least would have gotten that part right if I had gone on the road teaching it all the time. But I just, and I also found that after I'd written a book, I could do two things, one of two things. I could go on the road and spit it out and give talk after talk after talk about what a great theory it was, or I could write another book.
Right.
Because I would constantly have new ideas showing up. And I found that if I went out and talked about my old book, I didn't have time to write a new book.
Following, right.
So I would have never gotten to 35 books if I had done that. And they've been translated into over 30 foreign languages.
Right.
And that itself is kind of impressive, because usually if a book sells, the magic number that publishers use is they'll say, oh, it's gotten translated to 17 languages. And 17 is a big number to be translated into that many languages. But I've been translated into 30. I mean, gosh. That's great.
It is great. Absolutely. Congratulations. Because it's really, really a major, major welcome to the world. Because then people of all those 30 languages are going to be knowing about integral. So it's really a welcome piece, you know, to integral.
Yeah. I knew I had arrived when I got translated into blind Croatian. So there's like 8 blind Croatian And I sold like 4 books to those 8 people, but I knew I had arrived. That was
Right.
it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
He made an impact on the world. So I was always tickled about
Very
that
good.
one.
Very good. So when this person puts like either you are integral or a sage, I would say that you're both. I would think myself. What would you say?
Yeah. Remember, I have differentiated between the stages of growing up and the stages of waking up. And waking up has stages like yogi, saint, sage, non-dual, realizer. And growing up has stages like archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral, and then all of 3rd tier. I'm always kind of hesitant to categorize myself, because anytime I say something higher, it looks like I'm bragging.
Well, you can permit yourself to brag. I tell you, I swear to God that if I know a person in the world that can brag, it's you. So
Okay.
to me,
Well,
to me, you are a sage, which is at integral and even higher stages, I would say. I would say. I see you
well,
like this. Am I wrong? Am I wrong?
Yeah. Well, I could agree with something like that. I'm clearly, in growing up, I'm in a 3rd stage of development. And in waking up, I have had at least a dozen major Satori-like experiences, which is the highest non-dual awareness that can be achieved by any of the world's mystical traditions. So I particularly practiced an enormous amount of Zen Buddhism. I've done like 15 years of Zen, and then 20 years of Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana. But I've also practiced, to some degree, most of the major mystical traditions of the world's spiritual systems. So I've practiced Vedanta Hinduism and contemplative Taoism, Christian mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah mysticism. I've done several years of each of those.
Wow. Wow.
And once you get a breakthrough Satori in, for example, Zen, then it's much easier to experience Christian mystical states.
Yes, yes.
Because you've already had a major breakthrough into those areas of awareness. So that makes it easier for me to understand Vedanta, Hinduism, and contemplative Taoism and Christian mysticism and so on. So that I'll essentially buy what you're saying.
Yeah, that's
right.
But I understand that you don't want yours to be categorized, or you don't like to categorize yourself, because it's true that whenever you are a sage in more than integral levels, higher even integral levels, you don't want to categorize yourself, because you are beyond definitions, beyond categorizations, and beyond identifications. So thank you very much for the answer. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So let's go with another question that says, let's see, Oh, in case, no. Yes, in case that the metaphysic postulate presenting existence as an evolutionary impulse that goes always
Right.
forward, taking us toward improvement all the time, imagine that that doesn't exist. So then what aspects of the integral theory will fall apart if that, evolutionary metaphysic postulate of
Right.
evolve all the time forward wouldn't exist?
Well, almost all of the integral framework undergoes a development or an evolutionary aspect. So all four quadrants have various levels, and all of those levels have developed or evolved over time. The levels themselves, of which there are 9 to 12 that I've outlined in the upper right quadrant, the lower right quadrant, the lower left quadrant, and the upper left quadrant. Those levels themselves as levels don't display evolution just as a level. As a level, it's a stage in the evolutionary process, but just the stage in itself is something like concrete operational thinking, which is the structure of the mythic stage of development, or formal operational thinking, which is the structure of the orange or rational stage of development. But each of those are stages in an overall evolutionary unfolding. And if you took that evolutionary development away from them, it would cripple pretty badly overall integral theory, because integral theory includes evolution in so many of its components, simply because the data is what points to evolution. It's an objective reality. It's actually occurring. And as to why it's occurring, remember, we have a what of evolution and a why of evolution, and nobody doubts the stages of the what. And those stages of the what of evolution are my stages of development that I present, as I say, 9 to 12 or so in all the quadrants. And that's the what of evolution. And that's very important. And then the why of evolution talks about what's driving that evolutionary unfolding, because natural selection and random mutation just aren't enough to do it. Because we've got like 300,000 mutational changes.
Right.
And that's the why evolution keeps this extraordinary unfolding all around us.
I remember, Ken, when I was at the beginning of the integral, let's say, movement, which I had read 3 or 4 books of yourself, and I was already crazy with integral theory. All of a sudden, I had the opportunity to edit a book with 23 beautiful souls that wanted to talk about the 4 quadrants and write about their own vision of the 4 quadrants. And so these 3 people were very nice, and we were making 3 of them were talking about the upper left quadrant, 4 of them were about the upper right, and things like that. It was very, very beautiful. And I was making the introduction of the book and all that. And I was editing that to make them all together. And it was very funny because Kai Ross, which you know that in Spain is the one that has always published mainly your books, so many books, with David González Raga as your translator in Spain, you know that he said, well, what is the title we are going to put to this book? And I said, Integral Evolution. And he said, oh, but that's, Darwin. And I said, no, it's more than that.
Yeah.
It's more than that. And he was saying, really? Well, he was not very, with me on putting the name of integral evolution. And for me, it was very, very clear. So
yeah, and you're right.
It is very, now that you say this, it gives me like the reason, let's say, of, hey, I was right, in defending that book would be called Integral Evolution. Yes,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a very good point. And if you look at any of the really superior, great evolutionary biologists, like, let's say, Stuart Kauffman, he flat out says evolution is driven by a combination of natural selection plus self-organization.
Right.
And that's nowhere near what Darwin said. Darwin himself had trouble figuring out, well, why does this go forward so much? And he would say, I don't know. I mean, he was actually right. I don't know. And he didn't know. But
because he was a naturalist, not a mystic. He was not a mystic naturalist, which would have helped him a lot to see it in a more integral way. He was just a naturalist, you see, and a biologist. So, integral theory has brought this consciousness of integral evolution, which comes from corners of reality.
Right.
Absolutely.
And when evolutionary ideas were first starting to be understood, what they all really focused on was the what of evolution. Because you go back and you find the fossil record, and you find something called a Cambrian Explosion, which is a period where in the fossil record, thousands of animal forms sprung into existence in this very short period of time.
Yeah.
And why they did, nobody knew. Nobody could figure out. And it's still part of the big mystery of evolution, is why did this Cambrian period occur? And it's where most of the theories of self-organization or self-transcendence, it's the period. That's what most of these self-organization theories are trying to explain, is where on earth did this Cambrian explosion, it's called, come from? Well, it didn't. It wasn't just natural mutations, because one or two natural mutations every century is just not going to cut it.
No.
We need 100,000. Where are those coming from? Well, this actually existing force. It's a real force, and it's real, and it's there, and it's called self-organization.
Heroes. Yes, absolutely. So, Ken, would you please tell us about, do you have any nuanced response to the Gaza crisis and how we can practice integral ethics by taking both sides in the conflict? And given the circumstances of the world, what can integral teach us about nonviolence? Because now it's so clear that everywhere there is violence, everywhere. So what would you tell us about this response to the Gaza crisis?
Is this the question? Do you have a nuanced response to the Gaza crisis?
Yes.
And how we can
Yes,
practicing
sir.
ethics by taking both sides. And by both
Yes,
sides, you mean Palestinian and Israeli.
that's
Yeah.
it. That's it.
I think you do have to be a little bit careful to differentiate the degree of evolutionary development that both sides have. Because there, what we find is that, and a lot of liberals just get freaked out anytime you give a positive endorsement of Israel, because they see Palestinians as oppressed and put down and viciously attacked by Israel. But the matter is that Palestinians, their cultural center of gravity is largely amber, whereas Israel's cultural center of gravity is more orange and verging on green. So that's why Israel will do things like it'll pick particular times of the day when it won't bomb Palestine, and it'll just absolutely cease that kind of activity. Whereas Palestine just doesn't, the Palestinians don't do that kind of thing. They're very much more aggressive, even though Israel is responsible for some terrible, aggressive unniceties. And so I'm not just simply saying Israel is all good and Palestine is all bad. But Israel does take certain rational steps of de-escalating the types of attacks that they would do. Whereas Palestine historically has a fair amount of actual terrorist acts. And these are real terrorist attacks on Israel citizens. And I mean, the October 6th, October 7th attack was a very real terrorist attack. And then Israel, of course, responded with its own aggressive, intense, aggressive response. So, I mean, about the only thing that you can say would even the sides up is they're both show an intense capacity for aggression. And that's just unfortunate, but that is the nature. But if you look at the types of aggression, you'll find Palestine engaging in a true terrorist aggression, whereas Israel will do aggressive attacks, but they're rarely in the form of an actual terrorist attack. So the only thing that they have in common is a very aggressive orientation. And that's very unfortunate, but it's still, that's the case, as I see it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sometimes we can see it in the way that the Palestinians need to have a country, and they have never had the opportunity to have it. And therefore, because their area of living, was given to them, was taken off, let's say, separated and given a piece for them, which was really never like theirs, because there was all the time.
Well, they never supported a one-state policy. Israel has always supported a one-state policy. In other words, making Palestine a state along with Israel, which is often called a two-state policy. But Israel has always wanted Palestine to have their own state. Israel has been in favor of that almost from the beginning. Palestine has never wanted to give Israel a statehood. Palestine has never wanted a two-state policy. They've always just wanted to have their state, but they wanted to take Israel's away from it. And they're the main political force in the area that's fighting a two-state solution. Not Israel, Palestine. And that's a problem.
That is very subjected to discussion because
I can tell you don't agree, but that's just the way I think the facts
I know. I can see, and like you said when we had you were so nice as to give us this interview about the Gaza and Israel situation. You presented something which I just agree, and that you have somehow confirmed now, which is both of them need psychotherapy. So this is absolutely necessary, because it's true that they are both in, let's say, lower stages of consciousness, and therefore both of them need to really take psychotherapy to get this violent drive out of their system, let's say, and be more in the loving positiveness and sharing attitude. So anyway, let's go with the following question, which it has to do with the Atman project. In your book, The Atman Project, you described the psychic stage. The name psychic stage seems to accurately describe some aspects of structural development, for instance, filling biofields. What is your current understanding of what used to be called this psychic stage before?
Right. Well, I now call it the indigo paramind. And that is the next major stage after turquoise vision mind. And so what you start to get is all of third tier is marked by the fact that several of the major third tier stages have a mystical component or component of waking up that sort of goes with that growing up. And that's a novel occurrence, because mostly you can be at any stage of waking up and a different stage of growing up. If you're at a stage of growing up, you're not usually at a particular stage of waking up. But in third tier, you do. And so you have a unity with the gross realm, which is the beginning of what the indigo paramind does. And so it's the beginning of nature mysticism. And then when you get up into the violet stage, you tend to have more subtle stage phenomena. So you have deity mysticism is frequently present at that stage. And then you have an ultraviolet stage, which is one with causal. And so you have empty mysticism or emptiness mysticism. And then at the highest stage of supermind, you have a non-dual mysticism.
Right.
So indigo paramind is the first stage where you actually feel a oneness with the entire physical universe. So that's like a nature mysticism. It's a very real experience of a very real nature mysticism. And it can have all of the pathologies that nature mysticism has. And that can include a confusion of self and other, or a pathological fusion state between self and other. And all of the various problems with the nature mysticism can occur at the indigo paramind. Paramind, the word para simply means beside of or right side of. And that is, we're sort of moving beyond our mental framework and the mental. And so we have a paramind. And above the paramind is the meta mind, the meta mind. And that's an even greater degree of transcendence, which again moves into subtle stages. Beyond gross union, there's a subtle union. And subtle state, of course, is the realm of gods and goddesses and deities and spiritual forms and so on. So that meta mind, the violet meta mind, is a subtle stage. Transcendence often includes it. And then beyond meta mind is super mind, and that includes causal and non-dual. So third tier is very poorly understood. And the reason is that if you look at the percentage of the population that reaches each stage of development, when you're at green, almost 26% of the population is at green. Then when you move to teal, it's down to 5 to 7%. But when you get to turquoise, it drops to 0.5%. So the next highest stage, the indigo paramind, is even less than 0.5%. It has to be. And so that's putting it down to something like 0.1% of the population. And that's just not enough to even show up on most developmental tests. They don't test for anything higher than turquoise, right? Because they find enough people that are actually at that stage. So we really don't know that much about third tier. And that's why we're very careful to not automatically include waking up states with those growing up stages. But when we do find it, in the very few number of cases we can actually study, we'll find that
there is a correlation, right?
Has a relation with the gross nature mysticism, and then the subtle state and causal state and the non-dual state.
This is fantastic. Yes, yes. This is fantastic.
My theory, and that's why I include third tier, and almost none of the other developmental models, except for specifically transpersonal models like Suzanne Cook-Greuter's, has some third tier stages. Jenny does, but those are very rare. You don't find them in Bob Keegan or Jane Lovinger or Robert Lawrence Kohlberg. They don't have any third tier stages. At all.
Sure,
but
sure.
50 years from now, the percent of the population at the indigo paramind will be at least probably 5%, whereas it's like 0.1% now. But
Let's
it'll be
hope
5%. And yeah, that's the hope. And many developmental psychologists will be studying that indigo stage of development, along with the violet stage, the ultraviolet stage, and the clear light stage. So I look forward to that period.
Me too. Me too. If we are not alive still, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, but at least we will see it from the etheric world. So, Ken, a very personal question now that someone wants to know, why do you still keep on wearing that wig that you wear?
Do you not like it?
Don't ask me, because you know I am very sincere. Do you want me to tell you? Do you really want me to tell you? No, I don't like it. I prefer your bald head.
You're just not used to seeing me with hair. You're used to seeing the bald head.
Yes, I would prefer to see you in your bald head. Absolutely. Absolutely. I love your
Right.
bald.
Well, I started shaving my head largely because of Zen Buddhism when I was 25 years old. And I'm 75 now. So for 50 years, every single day, I shaved my head.
And you're
And I
tired.
never once grew it back. There about once every year or so for all 50 years, I would try and grow it back in. I'd let it grow back in, but I couldn't stand how it felt. I'd gotten so used to just feeling this shaved head. And so I couldn't actually let it grow back in. And when I first cut it, I would get a lot of glances because people were not used to seeing a 25-year-old kid with a shaved head. But then when I would try to grow it back in, that's when I start getting strange glances, because people that knew me anyway were used to seeing a bald head, and to see me growing hair, it just sort of upset them. And so about 6 months ago, I was talking to somebody and I said, I'm going to try and grow my hair in again. I've never been able to do it because I can't stand how it actually feels. I'm so used to just having a bald head. And they said, well, why don't you try a wig? And I just laughed. I thought, oh, have you seen how many old bald men wear those toupees and how horrible they look? I can't do it. Go ahead, try it. You might find something that works. And so I was out shopping one day in a large department store, and they had a section of just wigs. And I started to pull some of them on just for the hell of it. I found some that I actually liked, and they felt good on, and they looked okay. Although I wasn't really used to seeing myself looking like that. And so I've just sort of kept doing it, mostly because I could. I actually found that it didn't feel weird. I just kept, I'm used to how it looks. And so I just keep wearing it.
So it means you like it.
Yeah, I guess. I'm still not totally used to it. I'm not used to seeing myself with something on my head, hair. But I've become used to sort of this type of wig that I'm wearing now. I mean, it feels okay, which is important. It doesn't feel weird or odd.
Are you not going to go back to your bald hair?
I don't know. I'll probably keep wearing it just for a while because I can. Like I said, yeah, I have no problems with it. And
Fantastic.
people are about 50-50 with it. About half of the people that know me like it, and about half don't. So I'm not getting the kind of intense feedback one way or the other that would
I
lead
see.
me to get rid of it or wear it forever. So I'm also at about 50-50. I don't know. But I'm not, an enormous number of people aren't telling me I hate the way it looks, but very many people aren't telling me, oh, I love it. It really is almost exactly 50-50. So
even
that's
even even though I don't, even though I don't like it, I find that it looks good on you in the
well,
sense of,
that's yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and
I prefer your bald head, and
right,
yet I reckon that it does not look bad at all. So
right, and that's
if you
about
like it,
that point of view is about the 50% side that at
yeah,
least doesn't think it looks horrible or weird, or it doesn't look like those old toupees that all bald men wear,
which
and it's
definitely is
always
horrible.
twisted
Yeah,
and looks idiotic and it's totally obvious. I mean,
yeah.
so because I am not getting, I can't stand it. It looks terrible on you because I'm getting very little of that kind of feedback.
Yeah.
People like, well, I just don't like the way,
Yeah.
I mean, on you, but I don't like it. I prefer you bald. I very much like dance, but that's not fun enough for me to rip it off this afternoon. So
Right.
I'm just wearing it mostly to see if I get used to it myself.
Yourself. Yeah. Okay. So, Ken, thank you for answering this personal question. Now, let's go with your books, which is what is the difference in the contents between your books, Integral Meditation, Integral Spirituality, The Religion of Tomorrow, and this new Finding Radical Wholeness that it seems
Right.
it's going to be published already in May or so. So, could you
Yeah.
say that they are different perspectives of the same thing and therefore different Wilber stages? And is this new book bringing something new?
Finding Radical Wholeness is a very new type of book. So to go through them all, integral meditation is not much integral theory or integral framework, but it is the practice. What types of meditation can you practice that would take an inclusive or integral approach? And so most meditation systems divide up into two major types of meditation. Generally, it's called has some sort of form. So it could be a mandala that you focus on or something like that. Or it has something that's some phrase or word or mantra that you'll repeat over and over and over. Or it's a Zoom koan, like what's the sound of one hand clapping? And you meditate on that question. And then the other half is just formlessness. It's just you let your mind think whatever it wants to think, whatever shows up, you're just aware of it. You witness all of it with perfect equanimity, and you don't try to prevent anything from coming into your mind or going out of your mind.
Like
And
Vipassana.
and talks about those two types, and particularly points out the importance of the formless types of meditation. Then integral spirituality is a fairly intense discussion of the theoretical aspects of an integral spirituality per se. So it discusses what integral spirituality means and the various aspects of reality that it would include. And the difference between integral theory and integral spirituality is that integral spirituality is one aspect of an overall integral theory. It's the spiritual aspect. There's also a psychological aspect, a sociological aspect, medical aspect, and so on. Some dozen to 15 different disciplines that are all brought together, one of which is an integral spirituality that has with form and a formless meditation. And those areas are all discussed. And I go into those in much more detail in The Religion of Tomorrow. That's discussed if evolution continues and we get yet further stages and states of development, what will they look like? And so it's different from integral spirituality, particularly in looking at what form will integral spirituality have if evolution continues. So what will be the form of integral spirituality tomorrow? And then Finding Radical Wholeness is a very different book. I was calling it for a long time, Making Room for Everything. And it divided the types of practices we can do into 5 major types, which I call waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up.
Right.
And what I do is I take each one of those areas and discuss them separately. So I discuss what waking up is, and each of them is a different type of wholeness. So waking up is finding a wholeness for the entire physical universe. It's a nature mysticism. And so I go over the type of wholeness that each one of these presents. So when I talk about waking up wholeness, I talk about you being one with everything you're looking at. And I actually use Douglas Harding's simple but very clever metaphor called on having no head.
That sure.
Harding, who's a member of the London Buddhist Society, wrote a book called On Having No Head. And it's humorous, but it's also very serious, because he says, notice that you can never see your own head. As far as you don't even have a head. You can see your hands, you can see your feet, you can see your legs, your arms, your torso, but you can't see your head.
Right.
If you look, see are these 2 fleshy bulbs. This is your nose, but you can't see. You can get a mirror and hold a mirror in front of you, but that's not your head. That's an image of your head 2 or 3 feet out there. That's not your head.
That's right.
You head and I can see your head, but we can't see our own head. he says, so if you look for your own head and you try to feel what's like on this side of your eyes, all you'll see, if you're looking at an orange tree, all you'll see is the orange tree. And it's sitting right where you thought your head was. And just like the computer screen you're looking at now, if you look for where is this computer screen located, well, it's sitting right where you thought your head was. It's sitting right on your shoulders. And it's just, there's no distance, there's no separation between you and the computer screen. So subject and object are in a perfect non-duality. They're in a non-dual unity state of awareness. And so that's what a waking up experience is, waking up to this unity that you have with everything you're aware of now. You're one with all of it. All of it is sitting right on your head, right where you thought your head was. So that's waking up. Growing up is completely different from waking up. And it was an enormous discovery for me when I realized that the stages that were taught in Zen Buddhism were not at all similar to the stages that were taught in developmental psychology. I realized this in my early teens. I started meditating. I had a spontaneous satori when I was 13. And that gave me a very strong waking up with oneness with everything experience. But I discovered developmental psychology when I was around 14. And what I learned as I studied all the great developmental psychologists, Abe Maslow and his needs hierarchy, Jane Lovinger and her stages of ego development, Lawrence Kohlberg and his stages of moral development, and the stages of aesthetic intelligence, stages of emotional intelligence, stages of cognitive intelligence. We don't just have one intelligence. We have, psychologists vary, but somewhere between 8 and 12 multiple intelligences. And you can actually make a list of them and the type of questions that they answer. So like cognitive intelligence, or a typical normal thinking process, answers, what am I aware of right now? So my cognitive intelligence, like, is the intelligence that just sees the objective computer lying in front of me. But in addition to cognitive intelligence, we have an emotional intelligence. How do I feel about this computer? We have an aesthetic intelligence. Is there any beauty in this computer? So stages of beauty. We have a moral intelligence. Like, is this computer doing something good or something bad? And so on through around 12 multiple intelligences. And when I first discovered these 8 to 12 intelligences, what I did to find them in myself was I took one intelligence for each day of the week. And so when I would take moral intelligence, I would just think of moral thoughts. And I would think, am I being moral or ethical in what I'm doing now? And I just all day, I would think of what is a moral intelligence and how am I expressing my moral intelligence right now? And then the next day, I might do emotional intelligence. Okay, well, how am I feeling about this today? And the next day I do aesthetic intelligence and spatial intelligence. And each day I would take a different intelligence. And the funny thing is, you can actually realize these different multiple intelligences. When you think of an entire day of emotional intelligence and you live through that day, you'll really get in touch with your feeling intelligence. I feel. And when you do aesthetic intelligence, you'll really notice beautiful things in the world and you'll actually see them and you can feel your oneness with them, particularly if you realize you have no head. And so when I went through all of my multiple intelligences, I called the wholeness that results from that an opening up, because I was opening up to all of my multiple intelligences. And so I included all of those, and that gave me a type of wholeness that comes from opening up.
Yes.
So the wholeness I get from waking up is a wholeness with the entire physical universe. The type of wholeness I get from growing up goes from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral or systemic or unified. And the type of wholeness I get when I include all my multiple intelligences is a type of opening up wholeness. And I can actually feel, you actually do feel an increase in wholeness when you go through all of your multiple intelligences. And then when it came to cleaning up is the type of wholeness that is generally associated with Sigmund Freud. Freud and his inner circle. Freud attracted an enormous number of literal geniuses to his circle, and particularly his inner circle, which was composed of 4 or 5 literal bona fide geniuses. Carl Jung, which most people have heard of, Otto Rank, which also many people have heard of. He invented like the birth trauma. Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler, if you take, as researchers have done, and they polled all of the psychotherapists in America and asked, who do you follow? Are you a Gestalt therapist? Do you follow Fritz Perls? Are you a strict Freudian? Do you follow Freud? Are you an Adlerian? Do you follow Adler? By far, the largest number of psychotherapists in this country follow Alfred Adler. And the reason he was an incredibly clear and simple writer. And so when people would read Alfred Adler, they'd remember his version of how to do psychotherapy. And when they became psychotherapists, they would end up practicing Alfred Adler's version. Freud, of course, the best known of the lot. And most people learn the terms ego and id, for example, from Freud, because that's where they would hear the id was what they would read Freud or just hear Freud discussed. What most people don't know is that Freud never once used the term ego or id. He used the German pronouns, because the German pronouns that he used was the self, the I, and the it. And James Strachey, his official translator, every time Freud would write a sentence, like he was once famously asked, what does this new psychoanalysis of yours do? And he replied, where it was, their ego shall be.
Yeah.
But again, he did those terms. What he actually said was, where it is, their I shall become. That was his direct quote. And James Strachey changed the I to the Latin, which is the ego, and he changed the it to the Latin, which is the id. And he did that. He used those Latin terms because, as he put it, they made Freud sound more scientific. So all of Freud's books, with the exception of one, which is called The Problem of Lay Analyses, and I actually recommend you buy that and read it one day, because all Freud does is he'll say things like, the it can cause the I an enormous amount of pain. That's how he talks. And most people, when they split off some part of their psyche into an it, they actually refer to that split off part as an it. So they'll say, I can't control it. Or the obsession, it controls me. Or
right.
can't get rid of it.
Mhm.
Freud would want is to get their I back one with their it. So whatever they were repressing from themselves to produce this anxiety or this depression or this obsession, Freud would want them to re-identify with that it and make it part of their I. So where it was, their I shall become.
Mhm.
Well, that really made the most out of that formula was a guy named Fritz Perls.
Mhm.
And Perls something called Gestalt therapy, because he was from the Gestalt, the German school of psychology called Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt is simply German for whole.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so Fritz Perls would actually work with the I and the it in a very concrete way. So Perls was a big hero out at Esalen Institute. Esalen Institute, the first so-called growth center in America. And within a decade after Esalen's founding by our friend Mike Murphy, by the way, over 300 growth centers in America. And all of them were based on Esalen Institute, but it just exploded. And they would have things like therapy sessions and growth sessions and all of these workshops that they would give. And when Perls would give his, he would say usually at least 100 people would show up in the audience to watch Fritz Perls work on somebody's neurosis. Because he famously said, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes. And even his harshest critics tended to agree. Perls was a genius when it came to working with neuroses. And the way he would work with it is he would say, okay, who wants to work? And he'd call somebody up from the audience. And he would have in front of him, he'd have a chair. And he'd have the person sit in that chair. And then between the two of them, there was an empty chair, which was just called the empty chair. And so Perls would say, okay, what's bothering you? And the person would say, well, I have this anxiety and it's driving me crazy. It's driving me crazy. And so Perls would say, okay, I want you to take that anxiety and put it in the empty chair. And now I want you to talk to that anxiety. Ask it questions. And the person, they usually say, well, like what? They say, well, like, why are you bothering me? What are you doing to me? Why are you making me so painful and hurting? And so the person would say, oh, okay, I'll play along. So he would look at this empty chair, pretend his anxiety was sitting in the chair, and say, why are you doing this to me? And Perls would say, okay, now answer yourself. Sit in the empty chair, be the anxiety, and answer yourself. Tell them why you're doing it. So the person would sit in the empty chair and go, well, I'm causing you all this anxiety because you're worthless. You're no good. You're a rotten person. And they generally eat all the horrible things their parents had said about them or something. And Perls will say, okay, now answer that and talk, go back and forth and talk. And everybody in the audience could see what was happening, which is the more this person played the anxiety and spoke as that anxiety, spoke as an I am doing this to you because, then the more they were turning that it anxiety into an I. They were actually fine with it. And within about 15 minutes, they would be fully re-identified with their anxiety, and their anxiety would go away. And everybody in the audience could see this happening, and most of them would look at their clocks and go, well, that's 15 minutes. He's right. But that, I call that kind of wholeness, where you reintegrate the it with your I, the wholeness of cleaning up. And so I would explain sort of all the stuff I've explained to you goes in a chapter in the book. And then the final one, in addition to waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, was showing up. And showing up, I simply define as becoming one with all four quadrants. So it's to use an I, a we, an it, and an it's. Because each of those is a very real but very different form of knowing. And they're so real that they actually have real pronouns assigned to each of them. So the upper left quadrant is an I space, I, me, mine, and those are called first person. The first person perspective is the perspective of the person speaking. So it's I, me. Second person is the perspective of the person being spoken to. So that's you, thou, thine, etc. Third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a he, she, it, its, and so on. So all three or four of these perspectives are important. They each have a different epistemology. They each have a different methodology, and they're all very important. And usually a lot of the battles in philosophy are, is the I real, the self, or is the it, the brain, real? So is it mind or brain? And there's enormous arguments about that. And the answer is, well, both are real. They're just different perspectives of this self space. So there's an I self and an it self. There's a mind and there's also a brain. One's the upper left and one's the upper right. And then in the lower left, we have a you space. And an I and a you gives a we. So the lower left is the we. Yeah.
And yet, why do you call this? Because it seems that the word in itself, the terminology in itself of showing up, it seems more exterior, right? It seems a terminology which showing up, it's like I am, manifesting everything which is in the inside. I am manifesting it in the outside, and everything that I feel and everything that I think.
It simply means that all of these perspectives, first person, second person, third person, and fourth person, are genuine perspectives. They're actual dimensions of your reality. And if you want to be whole, you have to show up for all of the dimensions that you actually have. And you have a first person view, and you have a second person view, and you actually have a fourth person view. It's at all. They're not showing up for the fullness of what they are. And so that's what I call it, showing up. It means showing up for all dimensions and perspectives that you actually have as a reality of your being. Showing up for all of them or not.
I see. Ken, I need to go because I have a consultation right now. So could you tell us, please, when is finally this wonderful book, because it seems very interesting, and I am already wanting to read it to clarify more this showing up, to really make a whole of four quadrants in their manifestation of the inner and outer quadrants.
The
You know,
individual and the collective.
this integration of that as a show up, which seems external and yet is also internal, showing up my own self, let's say. So I am very much looking forward to read all that. Very interesting presentation. So thank you very much. And I would like to know, when is this book finally going to come out in the market?
I don't exactly know, but it's there. Shambhala is done editing it, so it'll just go to the printer, and it'll be a month or two, and it should be out.
Okay.
And it's a fairly long book because I have a lot of these chapters, and each dimension of finding wholeness, waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. Each of those 5 areas usually has 2 or 3 chapters written about it. So there's one that explains what it is, and then there's a chapter or sometimes 2 on practices you can actually do to realize this wholeness. So there are practices for waking up, showing up, growing up, opening up, and cleaning up.
Very good.
But it's a very easy to read book, which is why I like it. It's very simple and very straightforward and very clear. I think it's probably, I would probably count it as my favorite book right now.
Would you say it's like a summary of all your integral theory?
Basically. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, because, you know, it's the compilation of all your experience, vivid and real, you know, like giving to the world. So thank you very much for it, Ken. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this time with us on this Love Day, because you are a loving person, very generous, that you are giving us this interview so nicely. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Bye, dear. Bye, all.